Hello, my name is Anna Hersh, and for this project in anatomy and physiology, I was given the task to go over connective tissue. So first, I have an image of connective tissue. I chose this one because it has a lot of different aspects that can be clearly seen to be able to understand the different parts of what makes up connective tissue. Connective tissue has multiple functions. These include supporting cells and organs, as well as storing fat to help protect the organs. Connective tissue does its job by having a lower density of cells, as well as a higher proportion of extracellular content. When looking at connective tissue, we can see that it is made up of three components. The first would be the cells, which we see down here. Next, the protein fibers. And third, the ground substance. We can also see that together, the protein fibers and ground substance are what creates the extracellular matrix. Connective tissue proper is made up of fibroblasts, which contain collagen fibers, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers. Connective tissue proper is a combination of both loose and dense connective tissues. Let's start by discussing loose connective tissue. This tissue is found between organs. Its purpose is to absorb any shock to the body, such as my 3-year-old jumping off the couch or hurling himself down the stairs because he thinks he can fly like Superman, as well as it binds the tissues in the body together. Loose connective tissue is made up of 3 kinds of tissues. It's made up of adipose tissue, areolar tissue, and reticular tissue. Next, let's take a brief look at dense connective tissue. This kind of tissue is dense due to it containing more collagen fibers than loose connective tissue. There are 2 classifications of dense connective tissue. The first classification is regular dense connective tissue, and the second is irregular dense connective tissue. So let's take a step back and go into loose connective tissue a little more in depth. The first I mentioned was the adipose tissue, which is the first image right here. Adipose tissue is made up of adipocytes and extracellular matrix. This tissue uses capillaries, which are small vessels, to move and store lipid molecules. And as you remember from earlier lessons, lipids are fat. So it moves and stores fat cells and molecules. This kind of tissue can be found under the skin. It can be found around organs to cushion the organs, as well as making up breast tissue. The next one we have is areolar tissue, here in the middle. As we can see in this image, the tissue is web-like. You can see all the little fibers going in different directions, almost making a spider web pattern. This web-like tissue fills the space between muscle fibers, as well as surrounds blood and lymph vessels, and it also helps to support organs. The last connective tissue here we see is the reticular tissue. Reticular tissue is mesh-like in consistency. So if you look closely, you can see all the little fibers binding together, almost like mesh. This is the framework for the lymphatic tissue, as well as organs such as the spleen and the liver. Now let's take a deeper look into dense connective tissue. As you can see, like what we mentioned earlier, that dense connective tissue has more fibers than loose connective, and we can see it in this image as they're all bound pretty tightly together. And again, dense connective tissue consists of two types: regular dense and irregular dense. First, let's discuss regular dense connective tissue. This first picture here, this tissue runs parallel to each other. So you can actually see that here in the image as the fibers are almost in lines and they are parallel to each other. This structure enhances the strength and resistance to stretching of the tissue. This tissue, the regular dense connective tissue, is what makes up our ligaments and our tendons. Last, we'll see here on this picture, we have irregular dense connective tissue. Now, if regular dense connective tissue has parallel lines binding it together, then we're able to see over here almost the opposite. It has irregular. So the tissue goes in all different directions. This tissue fiber goes in random directions to create a covering for the organs, and it also forms the wall of arteries. Connective tissue is incredibly important for the body's form and function. Without these tissues, our body would not be able to function normally. Let's go over a few different questions to see if we can remember some of the important details. The first question, can you name the tissue in this image? Now, if you remember, this is the same image that we had earlier in the slide. Well, if you said that this is areolar tissue, you are correct. You also could have said it is loose connective tissue, since areolar tissue is loose connective tissue. What characteristics in the histology of the image was your identifying factor? So again, let's go back and look at the image. For me, I was able to tell by the web-like fibers, because if you remember, areolar tissue is web-like, and these appear almost like a spider web. How many types of loose connective tissue are there, and can you name them? There are 3 types of loose connective tissue. The first is adipose tissue, the second areolar tissue, and the third is reticular tissue. The next question, what is the difference in tissue fiber between regular dense connective tissue and irregular dense? If you remember, it goes back to this image, the regular dense versus irregular dense. If you answered that the regular dense connective tissue has parallel lines and the irregular has tissue going in all directions, you would be correct. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I hope it helps you to remember some of the information for the exam.